On paper, the Bigme HiBreak Pro Color sounds like the ideal e-ink smartphone. Android, Google Play, 5G support, and a color e-ink display with a dual-tone front light.
It all looks great, at least at first glance. But once you start actually using the phone, you quickly realize that things aren't quite as perfect as they seem.
In terms of hardware, this is basically identical to the black and white HiBreak Pro that launched earlier this year. You get the same thick bezels you'd expect from an e-ink device in this size class, the same button layout with volume buttons on the right and customizable controls on the left side, and the same flush 20-megapixel camera on the back. That flush camera design means the phone sits flat on a desk without wobbling. Always a plus. Unfortunately, Bigme hasn't addressed the button design issues from the previous model. The volume and custom buttons still rattle noticeably when you shake the phone or touch them. It's a minor annoyance, but definitely noticeable. The power button, which also acts as the fingerprint sensor, thankfully doesn't have this problem. And even though the haptics of the power button were fine on the original HiBreak Pro, the fingerprint sensor itself was one of the worst I've used. It was slow, unreliable, and rarely worked on the first try. But it seems Bigme has figured something out this time, because while the fingerprint reader on the HiBreak Pro Color still isn't especially fast, it's a lot more reliable and actually usable in everyday situations. For this review, I purchased the black version of the phone, which has a much nicer matte finish compared to the glossy plastic on the white version. It's still a full plastic build, just like all previous HiBreak models, but it looks and feels good enough. The frame and back cover don't attract too many fingerprints or smudges either, which is definitely a plus. There's also a protective case included in the box in case you want a different feel in the hand or just want to protect the phone better. The front glass is scratch resistant, and this time there's no pre-applied screen protector. The display still features a nice anti-glare effect, but I'd still recommend applying a screen protector yourself if you plan to carry the phone in a pocket. It still might scratch over time because this is not Gorilla Glass. The earpiece speaker and the bottom speaker work together to produce stereo sound. The audio quality is okay, and the speakers are loud enough for regular use. But when you crank the volume to the max, they do start to crackle slightly. The dual SIM card slot is located at the bottom of the phone next to the USB-C port. Unfortunately, unlike the smaller and cheaper HiBreak models, there's no microSD slot. That said, with 256 GB of internal storage, out of which 221 gigs are available to the user, storage really isn't a concern for most use cases for an e-ink device. There's also an IR blaster at the top of the phone, which could have been great if there were actually any software support for it. There's no pre-installed app to use it, and even though I didn't get an error message anymore, I still wasn't able to find a working one on the Play Store either. When it comes to raw performance, the HiBreak Pro Color is one of the fastest e-ink devices you can currently get. Powered by the Dimensity 1080 octa-core chipset, it scores 944 in single-core, 2479 in multi-core, and 2250 in GPU performance in Geekbench 6. That places it somewhere between a Snapdragon 860 and 778G. More than enough for anything the e-ink screen is capable of displaying. And yes, you can even play games like Doom or more lightweight alternatives. Not that you necessarily should, but the fact that it works shows just how capable the phone really is. It does tend to run a bit warm when under heavy load, especially in the upper part of the back. One thing that's often a problem with e-ink phones is global coverage. That's not the case here. The HiBreak Pro Color supports a wide range of LTE and 5G bands, making it one of the best options in terms of connectivity for a phone in this category. On top of that, you also get Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, NFC, GPS, and a compass. The display is where we hit the first real compromise. The 6.1-inch screen uses e-ink Kaleido 3 technology, which combines a standard black and white e-ink panel with a passive RGB filter layer to produce color. As with other Kaleido 3 displays, that results in two separate resolutions, 300 pixels per inch for black and white content and 150 pixels per inch for color. What this means in everyday use is that you'll see the same pastel-like colors you get with other color e-ink displays. Personally, I don't mind that. Once you stop comparing it to a regular LCD or OLED screen, those slightly washed out tones stop feeling like a drawback. In fact, having color support makes the interface and many apps noticeably easier to navigate, especially the ones that aren't optimized for e-ink in the first place. What stands out more is the subtle grain of the display surface. E-ink Kaleido 3 doesn't have the same clean paper-like look as monochrome e-ink panels, but even that is only really noticeable when you look closely, within about 30 centimeters or roughly 12 inches. From a normal viewing distance, it's not something that distracts or takes away from the experience. Because e-ink Kaleido is still a reflective technology, the screen performs extremely well outdoors and remains perfectly readable even in direct sunlight. Much better than any LCD. But the frontlight performance is where the display starts to fall short. With a maximum brightness of just 28 nits for the cold white LEDs, it's just a bit too dim to overcome the Kaleido 3's screen inherently darker background completely. I usually say that 30 to 40 nits is the minimum to improve Kaleido 3 readability, and I'd really prefer to see closer to 40 nits rather than something under 30. In other words, the display can look noticeably dimmer and grayer than other Kaleido screens, even when the cold white LEDs are turned all the way up. When you mix in the warm white LEDs, you can push the brightness up to around 54 nits, which is definitely much better, but it also gives the screen a much warmer tone. Not always ideal depending on the content you're viewing. All in all, the frontlight is a noticeable downgrade compared to the black and white HiBreak Pro. It's only about half as bright, and as is always the case with Kaleido 3, turning the frontlight off entirely makes the background appear much darker. That's because the RGB color filter is always present and darkens the image even when the light is off. So I'd strongly recommend using the Kaleido 3 display with the frontlight most of the time. And when you do, definitely avoid using the automatic brightness adjustment. It's still overly sensitive and reacts to even the smallest changes in ambient light, making it unusable in my opinion. That issue was already present in the black and white HiBreak Pro at launch, and unfortunately it still hasn't been addressed in the color version. And I think that leads us straight into the biggest issue with the phone, the software. It runs Android 14 with Google Play support, and Bigme ships this model with its new OS 5 user interface, which does bring a few visual improvements, but also introduces a few regressions. Overall, the software just doesn't feel polished. And this has been true with every Bigme device I've tested over the years. Decent hardware, but very little focus on refining the software. There are still quite a few Chinese characters scattered throughout the interface, even when the system language is set to English. The control panel can be pulled down, but unlike standard Android, you can't swipe it back up. Likely because it's a custom overlay rather than a native UI adaptation. The same goes for the settings menu. It mostly looks fine, now seems to be an actual adaptation of the original Android settings instead of being integrated as an overlay into the Bigme launcher, but has some messy text formatting issues and isn't as well optimized for e-ink anymore as the previous version. There are also several odd translations throughout the system, and the bottom navigation bar sometimes overlaps with other parts of the UI. All of this adds up to an experience that feels inconsistent and rough around the edges. And considering many of these issues were already present in the original HiBreak Pro and even earlier Bigme devices, I honestly wouldn't hold my breath waiting for them to be fixed. Another thing to keep in mind is Android updates. The phone runs Android 14, but chances are slim that it'll ever receive a newer version. That's not just a Bigme issue, most Android-based e-ink devices suffer the same fate. But it's still disappointing, especially for a phone. On the bright side, the current Android security patch level is from August 2025, which is fairly recent. Despite everything I've just said, the user experience is still surprisingly decent, thanks to Bigme's proprietary Super Refresh technology, which is on par with Boox Super Refresh when it comes to making e-ink feel dynamic. You can easily switch between different e-ink modes using the Quick Settings panel, which is accessible via the custom navigation bar. Bigme uses a lower quality mode as the default, probably to make the phone more responsive. But I don't agree with that decision, because it also makes the screen look more like a 100 ppi panel instead of the actual 300 ppi it offers. Switching to the magazine or comics mode is the better move for most apps in daily use in my opinion, simply because everything looks much better. The fastest mode can deliver up to 21 frames per second, which is impressive for e-ink and makes more demanding and dynamic apps surprisingly usable. But you wouldn't want to use that mode all the time, since it drains the battery faster and reduces image quality. There's also an automatic refresh feature that triggers a full screen refresh after a certain number of taps. That's incredibly useful for reducing ghosting in almost any app. Of course, e-ink is still a limitation, but I'd argue that's actually a feature, not a bug. A lot of people seek out e-ink phones to slow things down a bit, avoid distractions, and reduce screen fatigue. And even though the HiBreak Pro Color does a great job of minimizing the usual compromises that come with e-ink, the inherent limitations of the technology still apply. So, despite the shortcomings with the user interface, the Bigme HiBreak Pro Color still delivers very solid e-ink specific performance without too many compromises. And once you remove most of Bigme's apps, set up your own custom launcher, and make a few tweaks, the experience improves quite a bit. It's just unfortunate that Bigme doesn't take those extra steps themselves to offer a better experience out of the box. But thanks to Google Play support, you can easily install pretty much any app you like with just a few clicks. Android Auto is still a mixed bag, however. Just like with the Black and White HiBreak Pro, there's a scaling issue when connecting wirelessly in some cars. You can work around it by adjusting the DPI for Android Auto in the e-ink quick settings. And besides that, somehow it worked worse than with the original HiBreak Pro because the discoloration issue persisted longer and I wasn't able to interact with Google Maps at all. Hopefully Bigme will fix at least these most pressing issues. But I wouldn't hold my breath for the scaling issue to be fixed because it's been present on the original HiBreak Pro for months without change. At least the connection between the car and phone was stable and GPS performance was quick and accurate. And also same as last time, the rear camera is pretty decent. It's the same 20 megapixel sensor as in the black and white version, and while it's not amazing, it's definitely usable. There's still quite a bit of noise, but images are sharp and have good dynamic range. The front-facing camera, on the other hand, is pretty bad. Not great for selfies, but acceptable for video calls. Battery life is generally solid and should get you through a couple of days depending on your usage. It's hard to give a clear estimate because it really depends on what you're doing. Watching videos or running demanding apps in the fastest e-ink mode will drain the battery in a few hours, while using static apps will result in much longer battery life. That said, when used like a typical e-ink device, battery life is much better than your average smartphone. Charging is done via 18-watt USB-C, and while it's fast enough, wireless charging is not supported, which is a bit of a letdown considering that other e-ink phones like the Modida Compact and Minimal phone do include it.
All in all, I'm not surprised that the Bigme HiBreak Pro Color delivers decent hardware and an overall good app experience thanks to the excellent e-ink viewing modes. The title of the most uncompromising e-ink phone definitely goes to the HiBreak Pro Color. But 6 months after reviewing the original HiBreak Pro, I'm also disappointed that the Color version still has many of the same limitations as its black and white sibling, even with the version 5 OS update Bigme released. Software is where the magic should happen. And unfortunately, it remains the Achilles heel of every Bigme device I've tested so far. There are lots of features, the fundamentals are solid, and the e-ink modes are excellent, but the user interface still lacks polish. A lot. So would I recommend the Bigme HiBreak Pro? Well, it depends. If you're expecting a polished user experience right out of the box, or you're hoping of years of ongoing support and regular updates, this probably isn't the phone for you. While Bigme has shown a decent track record of releasing software updates for some of their devices, they don't commit to a specific timeline as far as I know. So it's hard to say how long this one will be actively maintained. But if you're willing to put up with its flaws and don't mind tinkering with launchers and settings, you won't find a more uncompromising e-ink phone right now. Check out my e-ink phone comparison right here, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss my upcoming Boox Palma 2 Pro review, which also brings color and a SIM card to the table. Thanks for your time watching, and I'll see you in the next one.